Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am Susanna Clark, Director of the Mahindra Humanities Center and the Morton B. Knopfel Professor of Music at Harvard University. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the Environment Forum, which is a series dedicated to exploring new work in the arts and humanities that reframes or reimagines the relationship of humanity to the rest of nature. It is convened by Dean Robin Kelsey and Professor Sarah Dimick. Today, Sarah Dimick will be in conversation with Emily Raboteau, who will be presenting on the topic of writing the climate crisis. I will introduce Sarah and then hand things over to her to introduce Emily and to get today's program started. Sarah Dimick is an assistant professor in the English department here at Harvard University. Before coming to Harvard, she was an assistant professor of environmental science and studies at Lafayette College. Sarah specializes in global Anglophone literatures of the 20th and 21st centuries, with a focus on literary portrayals of climate change and fossil fuel consumption, and the interrelationship between the ecological and the aesthetic impacts of climate change. This takes her into the arenas of environmental justice, environmental futurisms, and petrosthetics through a literature ranging from fiction, poetry, creative nonfiction, and memoir. Sarah is also one of the faculty leaders in the newly established Intergenerational Humanities Project, or IHUM, as it's being called. IHUM is a new initiative that was launched this fall by the Mahindra Humanities Center and the Arts and Humanities Division. And it brings together faculty, postdocs, graduate students, and undergraduates to explore new research and novel curricular design in the public humanities on the theme place and planet. So Emily, we are delighted to have you for today's Environment Forum. And without further ado, it is my great pleasure to hand things over to you, Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Susie. And hello, everyone. I want to add my very warm welcomes to Susie's greetings tonight. We're so glad you've joined us here at the virtual Mahindra Center. Tonight's event is open to everyone. So if you want to quickly grab a friend or a neighbor to hear Emily speak, you've still got a few minutes here while I talk. Tonight, it's my great honor to introduce the writer Emily Raboteau. Emily is the Stuart Z. Katz Professor in Humanities at the City College of New York, and she's the author of 2 books that will blow you away. The Professor's Daughter, which came out in 2005, and Searching for Zion, The Quest for Home in the African Diaspora, which received the American Book Award in 2014. Her work has recently appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Magazine, The New York Review of Books, Orion, and many other publications. I first encountered Emily's voice when I read her essay, Know Your Rights, which is part of the collection, The Fire This Time. In this piece, Emily reflects on how to discuss police brutality with her 2 young children, and she filters those questions through her observations of street murals in New York City. I remember reading this piece and thinking to myself, what a writer. I couldn't wait to see what she would print next. As it turns out, since the 2018 IPCC report, most of Emily's writing has grappled with climate change. I've noticed that people sometimes describe this focus on the climate crisis as a pivot or a turn in her career. But to me, it seems very much of a piece with her earlier work. Emily Raboteau is a writer concerned with risk and exposure. She's an author interested in historical accumulations and the continued weight of the past. She's someone who catalogs the strategies available to communities living under threat. And perhaps most of all, she's an artist working to craft a livable world. At this point in an introduction, I usually talk about how I admire or appreciate a writer's work, but I think appreciation feels insufficient in this case. I'm not only appreciative, but grateful. I'm grateful for Emily Raboteau's writing, grateful for the company of her words and her thoughts within these overheated years. Tonight, Emily is going to share a brief excerpt from her recent essay, Sparkbird, which was published in Orion. It's a piece that looks at Harlem's Audubon mural project and thinks about not only climate change, but gentrification, migration, environmental racism, and a whole host of other topics that become, in this essay, as in the world, so difficult to disentangle. After Emily reads, we will chat about both her writing and her photography practice. Both of us hope we will have plenty of time to address your questions during the Q&A after our conversation. So I want everyone to note there is a small button at the bottom of your screen where you can submit a question. It's the Q&A button. And feel free to let those accumulate over the course of the evening. When we turn to the Q&A, we will try to get to as many of them as we can. With that, let's give Emily a really warm welcome to the Mahindra Center. Thank you for joining us, Emily.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Your kind introduction has made me blush. I'm really excited to talk to you. I hope there'll be time also in our conversation for me to ask you some questions. I want to know more about what petrosthetics are, as Susanna introduced you mentioning petrosthetics. I'm so fascinated in the burgeoning field of environmental humanities and in your own interest in teaching and scholarship on climate fiction. So I hope there'll be some space to talk to you about your work also, even though I know I'm here to talk about my work.
Emily, would you be willing to read from Sparkbird at this point?
Yeah, maybe I should set it up just a little bit. I think you set it up well, but I'm going to read from the fourth section of an essay called Sparkbird that is 13 sections long. And that was very deliberate because I was modeling my structure after 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird, Wallace Stevens' poem, because there was so much I wanted to do in this essay. I wanted to talk about a public art project, which is the Audubon Mural Project that is an unfolding project in my area of New York City. And I wanted to talk about environmental racism, as you mentioned, Sarah, and I wanted to talk about my own kids, and I wanted to talk about birds, and I wanted to talk to the people involved with making this project. And I realized, all right, there's a lot going on. I need to give this some structural consideration. When I arrived at thinking I could just kind of go about this piecemeal, using that as a frame, it really opened me up to being able to share photographs of the birds and take it from all the angles I needed. 13 different angles on this subject. So I'm going to read the fourth section, which Sarah requested of this 13-piece essay, section 4. Here's what I can tell you about the Wilson's warbler, which I photographed at a storefront church called Iglesia de Dios el Refugio. They typically avoid the interior of the dense forest, preferring scrubby overgrown clearings and thin woods, staying low in semi-open areas, breeding as far north as timberline in thickets, second growth, bogs, along wooded streams, moist tangles, low shrubs, groves of willows and alders near ponds. They nest from coast to coast in Canada, but are far more common in the West. In the Rockies and westward, Wilson's warblers are often the most abundant migrants in late spring. Their young are fed by both parents, but brooded by the female alone. Their diet consists mostly of insects, including bees, beetles, caterpillars, aphids, and also some berries and spiders. 8 to 13 days after hatching, young warblers leave the nest. Their nest is usually on the ground, often at the base of shrubs, sunken in sedges or moss, shaped like an open cup made of dead leaves and grass, lined with fine grass and hair. If global warming keeps pace, 61% of its range will be lost. Here's what I can tell you about my habitat in northern Manhattan. I nest in a 3-room apartment with my mate and my young on the 6th floor of a mid-rise apartment building around the corner from a commuter bus terminal run by the Port Authority and 1 block from the on-ramp to the George Washington Bridge in a neighborhood choked by poverty and highways, the Trans-Manhattan Expressway, Henry Hudson Parkway, and Harlem River Drive. We talked to our young at 7 and 9 years old after the murder of George Floyd about how to protect themselves from the police who disproportionately apprehend Black and brown youth in our habitat. Among our kind, this grim warning is known as the talk. Our diet includes Chinese takeout from the Great Wall, roast chicken from Malecon, and pupusas from Mi Paso Centroamericano. On Halloween, our young eat candy they forage by trick-or-treating from the mom and pop shops along the business thoroughfare of Broadway. Across the street from the bus terminal is the church where we married and baptized our young, and where an undocumented woman took refuge for months with her American-born children as part of the sanctuary movement to avoid deportation to Guatemala by federal immigration agents. 2 blocks north of the Wilson's Warbler mural on Amsterdam Avenue sits an office of We Act for Environmental Justice, an organization that empowers low-income people of color to advocate for healthy communities. It is well documented that some of the most polluted environments in the nation are where people of color live, work, play, and pray. For instance, the 2016 Environmental Health Report on Northern Manhattan by We Act stated that, as a result of risks, including poor air quality from heavy diesel truck traffic, dirty boilers, power generation plants, and polluting municipal infrastructure like bus depots and sewage treatment plants, Harlem has a childhood asthma hospitalization rate 6 times the national and 3 times the citywide average. A 2017 report from the NAACP and the Clean Air Task Force showed that Black Americans are 75% more likely than other Americans to live in fence-line communities sited near facilities producing hazardous waste. A 2018 study by the EPA's National Center for Environmental Assessment found that regardless of their income level, Black Americans are exposed to higher levels of air pollution than white Americans, 1.5 times as much of the pollution from burning fossil fuels as the population at large. I am the mother of Black children in America. It is not possible for me to consider the threats posed to birds without also considering the threats posed to us.
Emily, thank you for that. It's always such a joy to see, to hear a piece read. I've read this piece so many times, but hearing it in your own voice is a real treat. I'm wondering if you would be willing to share some of the photographs that accompanied this piece.
Yeah, and this piece was published in Orion Magazine. Anyone interested could find it online there. But what I'm going to do is share my Instagram page, because I've been documenting these bird murals for quite some time, like years. Where are we? Bear with me. Okay. So this is from my Instagram page, which is, as you can see, at Emily Raboteau. And this is one of the murals. It doesn't exist in the essay because it appeared after I published the essay. So these murals have just been showing up in Upper Manhattan. I mean, people are making them. Sometimes you'll run across an artist painting one, but I want to convey that sometimes it just feels when you're walking through the neighborhood like a bird alighted overnight. It's like, oh, there's another one. This project, which is sponsored by the Audubon Society in partnership with a local art gallery and local business owners, aims to depict the hundreds of birds that are threatened by climate change and expected to be extinct by the year 2080, which is fast approaching, actually. So here is the red-naped sapsucker by the muralist Bluster One, who's painted quite a few of these birds. And it's located between 147th Street and 148th Street and St. Nicholas Avenue in Sugar Hill, Harlem. This is my kid, one of my kids, who across the street from this mural takes breakdancing classes. So that's why he's looking cool like this with his cousin who was also learning how to break. So that's one of them. And as you can see, they're painted on these roll down security gates of local businesses. So when the business is open for business, often these gates are up and you can't see the bird, and unless the business is closed, which some of them were during the pandemic. And at night, you get to see all the birds, you know, like late at night, because the shop owners close their security gates and they come down. So I'll just show you a couple others. That's one of my favorites. Here's the gyrfalcon. This one is on West 156 and Broadway. This one's a little different because it's on the wall next to a bodega. And I like this shot because you get the dimensions, like there's all this garbage in front of it, but this amazing falcon overlooking things. Here, let's see. Here's one other that I really like. This is by a muralist who goes by the Snowman, and it's called Goose Gets Down. This is one of the murals that's named. I really like this one because the artist is paying attention to the signage, right? So the goose is wearing Timberland boots, which is a nod to the fact that this is appearing on the security gate of a shoe store. So it's really site specific. After I took this picture, I have to go back and photograph it again because now evidently the goose has like a gold chain that's been added around his neck. You see he's wearing a Yankees cap too. So, you know, and here you see Goose Gets Down. And I'll show one more. I think let me see if I can find the Great Gray Owl because I really love that one. Forgive me while I scroll. Where are you, Great Gray? Oh, this one. Let's do this one instead. This one's great. This is the bald eagle at the Imagination Juice Bar. I don't have the address of this one written down, but it's next to the Municipal Credit Union, which is where I and other city workers get our cash. And they're often, you know, to keep warm, they're often unsheltered people sleeping in this little nook here, especially in the winter. And, you know, I just think there's some, I don't know, bad poetry or something when you see like this American bald eagle at the Imagination Juice Bar next to unsheltered people sleeping inside the Municipal Credit Union. But this is one of the most striking of the murals, which you can only see at night because the Imagination Juice Bar is usually open during the day. So those are some of the murals I wrote about in that 13 section essay in Orion.
Thanks so much, Emily. I love hearing about how the murals themselves are nocturnal. It's kind of amazing. They appear at certain times of day.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask you, Sparkbird, the essay that you've read from, and so many of your other essays about climate change are what a literature professor would call an ekphrastic essay. So a piece of writing that describes visual art. And when I think about other examples of ekphrastics, we can think about the people who pen odes to Grecian urns or write poems about Bruegel paintings. And here you write again and again about murals and street art and these public art installations. So I'm curious about what draws you towards public art, and what is it about that really captures your imagination?
Well, one thing is, particularly when we're talking about murals, but also public art installations that aren't murals, they have a shelf life, right? Like a mural could be there for a long time, but it's going to be affected by climate, by weather, by graffiti, by businesses changing hands, by somebody who just wants to tag over it, you know, like it's gonna transform. And so I have the instinct to document some of the particularly the murals that I find really beautiful in my local habitat, just because I know they're not going to be there forever. And if I can photograph it and also write about it, it's a way of holding on to it and sharing it with people who don't live in my local habitat, who might be interested and might benefit from learning about it, or just appreciate its beauty. You know, I'm fortunate to live in a neighborhood that feels like the street is a museum, you know, like to have these birds. There are, as I mentioned, hundreds of them, and there will be more. Just landing like that, it's such a treat. And it's, as I described in the essay, like Broadway's like a gallery, you know, the gallery of Broadway. It's like an outdoor museum. And then I guess the other piece is I used to be, before having kids, I used to be a travel writer. For Searching for Zion, my second book, which you mentioned in your generous introduction, I traveled all over the world writing about the theme of that book, which was people who had left, Black people who had left America, the Americas, looking for exodus elsewhere. So people who had made reverse migrations to different countries looking for Zion or a sense of home out of feelings of displacement, disenchantment, disenfranchisement, and dispossession. And I love getting to travel. You know that feeling you have when you're in a foreign place where you're more awake and alert to your surroundings, where colors seem more vibrant, where it's almost like a feeling of being in love, you know, and if you're a person who suffers from the beauty of wanderlust. But then I had kids, and then like the pandemic happened, and so I'm more grounded. And so for me, also documenting public art is a function of being stuck, right? But still wanting to achieve that feeling of being in love with the world. And so I find that if I can open my eyes to my surroundings, there's all sorts of beauty, you know, and it's just a way of paying attention, like the kind of attention I used to pay more easily when I was abroad. I've had to learn to train my eye on my direct surroundings in my local habitat. And for me, public art is the thing that I'm interested in. Also because it's often the expression of the people about larger issues and beings, but done in a way that I find really unique and beautiful and interesting, depending on the art, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. I love this idea of archiving your work as kind of generating an archive of these pieces that will be there for however long they are, and then something new will arrive in its place. I also think a lot about, there's been so much attention paid to land art, something new like Andy Goldsworthy or these other people who create with the landscape. But I think less attention has been paid to the sort of land art that you are working on, probably because it's urban in that sense. So I'm really grateful for all of that you do. I wanted to ask about the photography, because it strikes me that a lot of people who take photographs and describe places in the way that you do think of themselves as participating in a tradition of documentary work. So documenting either a situation or a story or an occurrence. And I'm curious if you think of yourself as a documentarian, or if that's not a lens you would apply to your own work.
Thanks for that question. Yeah, I do think of myself increasingly as a documentarian. I'm not even sure. I mean, I have like fights with editors sometimes. For example, this Sparkbird essay, I originally pitched it to another publication and they wanted to pair me with a photographer, like a professional photographer. I would describe myself as not a, you know, I'm not professionally trained as a photographer. I take pictures with my iPhone, and it's a way of taking notes for my writing, or at least I thought for a long time that's what I was doing, until I began to understand that the pictures themselves were part of the story. And not only the pictures, but the fact that I had taken them and that I had framed them in particular ways. very, very conscientiously and very purposefully. So, I didn't want to be paired with a photographer who didn't live in my neighborhood, who didn't love the people the way I feel I love the people who I also want to be part of the pictures of. None of those pictures of birds are absent of a person, because it was very important to me to make ties between the people who live in the neighborhood and the dangers that are threatening them in terms of environmental hazards, and the birds that are appearing in that neighborhood and the environmental hazards that are threatening them. So, I bring this like sort of editorial struggle up just to say, I've come to understand as a writer that my own lens and my own use of photography and documentary style of storytelling is something more than just writing, and it needs to be my photographs. I hope to get better at photography, but it seems to me wrong-minded at this point to either not include photographs or to have another photographer taking pictures for my story, right? So yeah, I do think that's a way I would like to describe myself as a documentarian, a documentary writer, a writer of photo essays. Yeah.
Yeah, especially thinking back to 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. I mean, the perspective is so crucial, and having someone else adding like a different perspective to that, I think would have introduced a feeling of disorientation, or someone, especially if it was someone not from the neighborhood who doesn't have that like personal connection that you do, it would be a little bit more of an outsider's view. And I loved this as a piece about a place that you were intimately embedded in. That felt so crucial to me with this essay.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask about the way that your friends and your community appear in your writing. You've just talked about how knowing some of the artists and the neighbors in this piece was so important. And as a reader of your work, I notice how often, particularly in your climate writing, your friends make appearances. So in Sparkbird, we have Camilla and Aisha, who are actually quite worried about the bird murals and their possibility of increasing the rate of gentrification in the neighborhood, which is a really wonderful way to get a different perspective on the murals, thinking again of the multiplicity of takes on these works of art. And then in some of your other climate writing, you've even done joint pieces where you've written an essay, and then our mutual friend Mick Owake has written like another essay that speaks to that one about your journeys together to look at these public art installations around climate change. So that's one where we have actually two writers who are friends approaching the same subject and speaking about each other. So I wanted to hear about the value of friendship for you within the climate crisis. I think often we hear a lot about family within the climate crisis, and I'm interested in that too, but I thought I would ask you about friends and what it's meant to create friends as a climate writer.
Sure, thank you. I just, as you were talking, I hope you don't mind, I shared a screenshot of our mutual friend, Mick. There he is.
A wonderful climate writer in his own right.
Yeah, he is, and has become a companion for me. Our friendship arose in kind of an unusual way, in that I wanted to explore climate change with somebody else, and that couldn't really be my spouse or my kids because they were too young. And he was just another concerned citizen who I found on Twitter and invited to go on this journey with me to explore a climate art project that had appeared. It's since come down, but here is a picture that I took of him in front of another climate installation in Union Square. Those of you who are in the city or have visited the city might have seen this clock and not known what it's about. This is Union Square South, and the clock is ticking And it's basically showing how much time we have, how many days, years, days, hours, minutes, and seconds left to curb greenhouse gas emissions, enough to give Earth a chance at keeping the world under 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. So yeah, I think that for me, partnership in trying to, or I should say community more than partnership, in trying to process the magnitude and the scale of the planetary crisis, just helps with not feeling entirely despairing or stuck or you know, lost or whatever. Is just, I think I figured out through Mick, I have to really thank him for joining me on these sort of journeys to look at and discuss art that appears in our mutual city, for like the gift of just having someone else to process it with, makes it feel less less crippling, right? So yeah, he was a big part of an essay that I wrote in the New York Review of Books, which was called Climate Signs. And he wrote about that experience of journeying around to visit these climate signs, which is another work of public art by an artist named Justin Guaribia. And he wrote a beautiful piece on his own. And those two pieces are kind of companion pieces. It was easier to do with someone else. I'm increasingly finding I like working with others on this subject because it's too much to handle on my own. It's very hard to write about.
Yeah, I think about this so often. I think scientists who are confronting climate change often have these labs or teams that are built into their work. And historically, writing has been, it hasn't had that by default. It's certainly been created and writers always work in community. But I think to me, that has seemed increasingly crucial for writers who are approaching climate change. It does seem like such a weighty thing to take on if you are thinking just by yourself. So I'm glad you're having that and are able to forge those connections. I also think it's a really beautiful literary friendship, and that's worth so much in of itself.
It's true. Mick and I had made a date to go see Maya Lin's installation, Ghost Trees, in Bryant Park. For those unfamiliar with that project, it's since come down, but Maya Lin erected in Bryant Park all of these trees that had been killed by saltwater intrusion, and she erected them just so you could see this very haunting. She imported that landscape from somewhere in New Jersey into the heart of the city, and it was very beautiful. We were going to go witness that together, and then I got COVID, so we couldn't. But I like the idea of inviting Mick on future excursions in the city to see public art related to the theme of climate change.
Yeah, if you go, please write about it. I feel like as a reader, one of the joys is watching that friendship unfold over the course of your writing.
We will. Yeah, we will.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you a little more about New York City itself, Emily. As you've described these paintings in Sparkbird of the owls and the warblers, you're also reflecting in that essay about asthma and access and exposure of particular communities to police brutality. And it's an essay, I think, that really refuses to ignore environmental injustices, even as it's dwelling in all of this beauty and these connections that are being formed around these murals. So when I think about issues that are at the forefront of my mind here in Boston, I often think about affordable housing and the climate crisis. I think that's something our city is going to have to confront. But I'm curious for you in New York, what's on your mind as you think ahead to the next few decades? Questions or concerns or hopes you have for your city?
Being a coastal city, sea level rise is a major concern to New York. We have sunny day flooding in the subways, even when it's not raining. Our infrastructure is not built for what's happening already, not to mention what's going to continue happening in the decades to come. So yeah, I'm concerned about all of the properties already that are at risk of flooding and actually have to deal with intrusion of water when we have storms during hurricane season. The low-lying areas of New York City, this is already a reality. In addition to that, as I wrote about in Sparkbird and have written about elsewhere and continue to write about, air pollution and poisoning infrastructure particularly placed in communities of color, fence line communities, affecting children and adults. I have asthma now as well. I didn't have it as a child, but having lived where we lived for so long, both my children and I now have asthma. And another thing that I think about a lot is the urban, the heat island effect, right? We've learned that cities with parts of cities, well, cities in general are much hotter than their outlying suburban communities. And that not only that, but within cities, there are what they call hot pockets where, especially in places without enough green space, you see this in areas of the Bronx and in Brooklyn that are even hotter than other parts of New York City. So for people who struggle to afford air conditioning, or who struggle to afford, not just the air conditioning unit, but paying for the electricity to keep that thing running, who may already be suffering from the poisoning infrastructure in their neighborhoods, i.e. asthma, from, fumes, traffic fumes, landfills, things like that. You're also having now to contend with dangerously high temperatures in the summer that lead to heart disease and conditions. It's actually kind of hard to account for heat-related deaths, because it might be a cause of death might be given as a heart attack, when actually it's because a person was in a hot box of an apartment without very much ventilation and air conditioning. So those are three things I think about a lot in relation to the climate crisis in my city.
That's so helpful. Yes, I think it's going to be so important for cities to stay in touch, especially coastal cities in the next few years, and share strategies. Yeah, I always tell my students that the climate crisis is universal but uneven. And I feel like you have to emphasize the unevenness, even as you're thinking about something unfolding on a global scale. It certainly hits some people more than others.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think it's also worthwhile for those of us who are in first world, more privileged situations, to learn from communities, especially coastal communities, about their strategies for resilience, rather than treating people or looking at people, even in media, just treating people as victims. I want to know, I wrote a book review on the subject of sea level rise, and was sort of a sea level rise as it pertains to the United States, and was kind of distressed that Puerto Rico wasn't a part of that conversation, because I feel like we can learn a lot from Puerto Ricans post-hurricane about actually on the local level, like what it takes to move through something. Not only what is absent and what is needed to fix problems, but also how people on the ground are dealing with sharing resources and helping one another in communities. We need those messages too.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's so important. Yes, an exchange of information, and certainly an exchange of resources, especially when we're thinking about places like Puerto Rico. So I have one final question for you that I want to toss your way before we open it up to questions from our audience. I see they are already pouring in for you. But you described in that book review you just mentioned, you described climate writing as a genre that cannot keep pace with its subject. And I'm so often asked to describe climate writing, and I love that description. It is a genre that cannot keep up with its own subject. So I wanted to hear from you as a writer, in what ways that's been your own experience. Do you find yourself halfway through a piece and then needing to adjust? Because climate change has shifted your understanding of your own work? Do you feel that it's particularly important to publish quickly in this genre? In what ways does the pace of the climate crisis itself impact your experience of yourself as a writer?
That's an excellent question. I'm not sure I have an easy answer to it, but number one, I think the swift pace of the crisis leads to a sense of urgency for writers who feel like they need to apply their skill towards addressing the subject. Two, for those of us working on climate who are literary writers, who need to take time, right? Like the essay that I wrote where I about my experience walking around New York City with Mick, it took me like 2 seasons to write that, to process the science, to figure out the structure. And, you know, like, yeah, some of the science had shifted by the time it was published, but I think what I'm attempting to do, and what a lot of writers who I really admire, including Amitav Ghosh, including Royce Granton, and others, is I think to try to write something that will last beyond the moment. And so when you think about like literary writing that is really of a time and place, but that persists beyond that time and place, you have to ask yourself, like, what is the larger issue at play? Like, what is the theme here that is everlasting, despite the fact that this is of a moment? So one thinks, for example, of George Orwell shooting an elephant, right, in Burma in the 1930s. Why do we still read and teach that essay? Well, he's written beautifully about colonialism in a particular time and place, but he's also writing about power and abuse of power. And so the theme is very big. I think we're in a time right now where there is a kind of global awakening of consciousness to a crisis that affects all of us, and it's very unsettling. But to try to capture that feeling, it's a twin feeling of being unseated or unsettled from a place of comfort, and a simultaneous feeling of awakening, I think is what those of us who are drawn towards this theme are trying to do. So in a way, like that the science is shifting is incidental to the fact that a larger psychological moment is we are attempting to capture. And as Amitav Ghosh says, if we don't attempt to capture that, our future readers, i.e. our children, will look back on what we're writing and think that we're deranged. He writes about this in his wonderful essay and book of the same name, The Great Derangement.
Yes, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I often describe this as a really generative time to be working on the topic, even as it's terrifying. So it feels all the more crucial, and I'm just grateful you are taking it up. I have maybe like 20 more questions for you, Emily, but I'm going to turn to our Q&A because I do want to make sure we get to some of these wonderful questions that have come in. So I'm going to read one off for you and then let you have at it. All right, so this first question is for you. Our questioner asks, in your essay, Climate Signs, I noticed that you cite eco-philosopher Timothy Morton, and that you seem very familiar with the environmental humanities. Can you tell us about the way that you view the relationship between creative nonfiction writers and scholars in the environmental humanities? Or perhaps I should say the relationship between creative nonfiction and the environmental humanities. So yeah, do you see the line between creative nonfiction and scholarship as porous, or do you see those as two distinct endeavors?
I'd like to hear your take on this too, Sarah, as somebody who's working in this field and is very well read in this field. And I want to piggyback on that question with my question for you, which is, what is Petrosthetics? I'm just fascinated to learn more about that from you as somebody who works in environmental humanities. So I think there probably is a distinction between scholarship and what I would describe as creative nonfiction in this field. although it may be blurrier than I understand, and perhaps Sarah can speak to this. But I think when we're talking about creative nonfiction, there is space for the first person, for the self, to be the witness. That is the lens through which we're exploring these large issues. Whereas perhaps in scholarship, there's less room for that. I don't know. Maybe there's more elasticity than I understand. And as Sarah has just sort of hinted, I think this is a very generative and interesting time for writing that touches on this theme, where a lot of radical and experimental things are going on. So I don't want to be black and white about saying scholarship is here and creative nonfiction is here, particularly for students who may be studying environmental humanities. I think that you should be encouraged to use yourself as a lens to study your local habitat, because it's a way of, one hopes, reaching others, like reaching lay readers who may not be as attuned to scholarly language, to be drawn into and to care, right? Like, we haven't really gotten into this, Sarah, but one of the reasons why I'm doing this and others are doing this is because we hope that the messaging will become like a drop in the bucket of all the messaging that needs to happen in order for politicians to understand this matters to their constituents, in order for there to be effective change, right? It's not just writing for writing's sake, but it's writing that we hope will shape hearts and minds. It's a corny way of saying it, but you know what I mean.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I would echo all of that. It's actually one of the things I love about the environmental humanities as a field. So I do think there's a little bit more crossover between scholarship and creative nonfiction and journalism than I've seen in some other fields at the current moment. And I think part of that is just a sort of all hands on deck feeling.
Yeah.
I think Amitav Ghosh is a good example to think about, someone who not only writes incredible climate fiction, but also takes up some literary criticism, but I think in a way that really reaches a public audience. So I think people are really quite experimental at the moment, and I think that's honestly good for everyone involved. The more dispersion of ideas we can have, I think the better.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I will toss another question your way.
Wait.
Yeah.
What's Petrosthetics?
Oh yes, Petrosthetics. We had Jennifer Wenzel come earlier this semester, and she gave a whole talk on Petrosthetics. But I will just briefly say Petrosthetics is the study of the way that oil and other fossil fuels shapes and impacts literature and art. So how does it shape our aesthetics? So I'm thinking about like both oil writing, something like Ken Saro-Wiwa's A Month and a Day, or Halan Habila's Oil on Water, these narratives that really emerge out of oil cultures. But also the way that like visual artists have really been drawn to oil spills, and all of these particular aesthetics that sort of cluster around our petroleum culture. Some people even consider like road trip narratives, like the classic American road trip story, as part of petroaesthetics, something that's generated by our fossil fuel culture.
Got it.
A very quick answer.
Thank you.
Of course, no. I love talking about it. All right, we've got another question. Emily mentioned a term I had never heard before: environmental justice. I'm so glad this person is asking this. I wonder if she can expound on that term. How is it similar or different from social justice? What work could someone new to the cause do in the name of environmental justice?
Yeah, I think that environmental and social justice, like if you had a Venn diagram, they would go like that. Like there's a lot of overlap between those two terms. Environmental justice, and please add to this, Sarah, I think is, it's like a striving to undo the ways that racism and classism play into the unfair placement of poisoning infrastructure, for example, in communities of color. So, environmental justice, like the organization I mentioned in the essay that I just read from, We Act, which is in Harlem, has as its mission to increase awareness and fight against things like fossil fuel plants or landfills being placed just, as a matter of course in a Black community. This is what happens again and again, and it leads to health risks and all kinds of inequities that like a kid who has asthma or poisoning from the air, like, is going to do less well in school, and so on and so on. So I think environmental justice calls, just as social justice does, for increasing awareness and fighting against or fighting for more equity in terms of the balance of, especially how things show up in our built environments. What am I missing in terms of thinking about environmental justice, Sarah?
That's brilliant. I do think it might be interesting for this questioner to go look at the principles of environmental justice that came out of the 1991 People of Color Leadership Summit in Washington, D.C. I think that's the first place we see environmental justice as a term really defined. And it's that idea of thinking of environmentalism in the places that we live, work, and play, which is a phrase Emily uses in Sparkbird. So instead of just wilderness or kind of places that we think of as out there, environmental justice is about our homes and the public health in our communities. Okay, here's a great question. My understanding of the term sparkbird is that for birders, it's the bird that made them want to be ornithologists. Did you have a spark book that made you want to be a writer, or that inspired you to start writing about climate change? A spark book.
I mean, I have a spark author.
Okay.
And that's a lot of writers spark author for a good reason, and that's James Baldwin.
Mm-hmm.
So he's a writer a lot of us consider to be his children, insofar as we, I think, really study him on a sentence level, just for mastery of the English language, but then also with extreme admiration and appreciation for his incredibly nuanced and incredibly generous gift of writing about race in America, issues pertaining to justice, but doing it in several different genres. So he wrote wonderful nonfiction. He also wrote fiction. He also wrote a play, some poetry that wasn't very good, but I love that he tried. And I also love that he uses the self and like the family as ways of talking about larger, his complicated relationship with his father, write about it in a way that you understand the complicated relationship to paternity and patriarchy of the nation. And so just, a genius at writing both personally and personal political essays is what I'm trying to say. Like I've learned so much from him and fell in love with him as a young emerging writer. As an undergraduate, I took a class, a single author course in James Baldwin that really shaped me in my desire to be a writer. And secondly, I don't think I have a book that was my spark book in terms of my interest about climate change, but I do have a spark essay. And that was the essay by David Wallace Wells that then became the genesis the prototype for his larger book of the same name, which is The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells. That essay came out the summer before the IPCC report came out in September of 2018. And I think the coincidence of those two things, David wrote sort of, in some ways, in some circles, he's even criticized for the way he wrote so explicitly about like the horrors of what is expected to come and what is already underway in language that was like a Jeremiad, right? Like almost pornographically dark writing of the kind of that would have like a visual synonym in disaster movies, right? It was just kind of like, oh my gosh, this is bad. Woke me up. It woke me up. And so that when the IPCC report came out, which is like, you know, it's science, I had this sort of narrative in my head that began to understand, I really have to pay attention to what's going on and be alert to this and try to move on it and act on it and be engaged with it because it matters that much. And then finally, I want just to say that the writing of Barry Lopez has been very important to me. He was a mentor also before passing away last Christmas. Before we close tonight, I want to read from something he wrote to me in a letter, because I know there are a lot of people in the audience who are writers and interested in environmental literary writing, and the advice that he gave to me, I would like to share with the audience as well.
Thank you for sharing that. That's going to be a gift. I feel like it's another moment of community and mentorship and friendship within environmental writing.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to hear the answer to the next question. Emily, do you have suggestions for ways that parents can introduce the topic of the climate crisis to their children? Also, I'm curious how you connect your love of nature and the environment and concern about the climate crisis with your children living in a high population density area. So how do you talk about children with this? And especially as someone who lives in a high population city, how do you connect children to the climate crisis?
I think it depends on the age of the child. Obviously, talking about the climate crisis with a 5-year-old would sound different than talking about the climate crisis with a 15-year-old. In either case, I think the conversation should begin with a question, which is, how much do you know about the climate crisis? I'm willing to bet that unless the child is really, really young, i.e. 2 or 3, they already know more than you may think. And they already probably have a degree of anxiety about it. And that is why I think the conversation is very important. It's not only important to have with the child, but also I think to have with the child's school, to understand how it's being taught or addressed in this or not in their school. I think that the way to go about it with young children is really to enter into the conversation through the lens of love, that all of us have things we love in this world. For a child, that might be their pet, right? That might be any number of things, but that all of us have in common, whether we're children or adults, something that we love and that is to a degree, in reality, under threat, right? And so I think approaching it as, you know, what are the things that we can do as people to protect those things that we love from suffering, from endangerment? What are the things that are being done already? And how can we link into those ways that people are helping so that we don't feel despairing about this, right? So that might look like, if the child is ready and interested, teaching them about youth movements and activist Sunrise Movement, Fridays for Future, even just letting them know if they don't want to participate. Like, this is what some kids your age or close to your age are doing all over the world. Isn't it amazing that they're getting the adults to listen? Let's talk about what you might do, or whether or not you want to do something similar, because you also have a future that we want to be bright in some ways, right? But I think one has to be careful with the language, because especially for kids who have anxiety, and many of them do around this subject, we have to tread lightly and be very careful not to increase their terror, but rather to give them ways to act so that they feel empowered. The second part of the question had to do with my environment being in a city with young children. Yeah, I think that for people outside of the city who may not fully comprehend how much green space there is here. We've since the time that I wrote Sparkbird moved from Upper Manhattan to the Bronx, which has its own reputation, but also happens to be the greenest borough in New York City. So I think spending time in parks is a way. We have beautiful parks in the city. Everybody knows about Central Park, but there are many other beautiful parks in Brooklyn. There's Prospect Park, and there's Van Cortlandt Park, which we live very close to here in the Bronx. That it's actually not that hard to get lost in nature, and increasingly, in part because of the work of Robin Wall Kimmerer, who many in the audience may know, I am coming to understand the importance of becoming more literate, plant literate, and also educating my children in the names of plants, in the sentience of those beings around us, as not being it, but being kin. And so that's something I'm also able to do, even though I live in a city. We have, a tree outside, which I now know is a London plane tree. And so I teach my kids about that because I want them to love their tree as much as they love their cat. And to also understand the ways that it's part of our community and what it's doing for us and what we can do for it.
Yes, I love that answer. I think often, especially in cities like New York that have such incredible architecture, it's also just interesting to think about the presence of rocks all around. I mean, everything there is, even things we don't think of as environmental, often are at their core.
Mm-hmm.
So, all right, another question. This writer says, "Thank you for your beautiful work." I think we can all echo that. Thank you for your beautiful work. I feel there is often a disconnect between these powerful narratives and the more factual or maybe boring way that those of us in the scientific environmental community often tell our stories. Do you have tips for science communicators about how to incorporate literary work and themes in our approach?
Yeah, I'm teaching a climate writing class right now, and it's for people who have enrolled in the MFA program in creative writing who mean to be doing creative writing. But I think what I teach them is what I would teach or say to anyone who's working in science communication, which is to learn from writers that you admire and really study how they're doing it on the level of craft. Because if it mattered to you when you read it, it wasn't magic. Like, it was a structured and deliberate thing they did. Whether that's me or any of the number of people writing in this along this theme, is to think, okay, they allowed themselves to use the first person, and that mattered to me as a reader because I felt affected or emotional when they described their own fear about sea level rise. What would it be for me as a scientist or a communicator about science to take off my scientist hat for a moment, even though having it on is also important in this essay, just to say, in addition to being a scientist, switching that hat, putting this one on, I'm also a parent, and I'm really freaked out about the future of my child for the following reasons. How does that expand upon the essay and make a bridge to people who don't have the same science vocabulary, but also have children or something that they love, that they want to protect? Also, one might not have the skill or the interest or the time, and can make a relationship with a writer. So, to try to explain what you're doing as a scientist working in the field of climate to a colleague or a friend who is a writer, and to ask them to be part of your community in expressing the science that you need to express, such that it can be digested and consumed and understood, appreciated, and felt by readers outside of the sciences who might be impacted by it.
Yes. If you want great science writing around climate, I always suggest Elizabeth Kolbert's work. Under a White Sky recently came out, but she's probably best known for The Sixth Extinction, which I think is full of some fascinating science writing around climate and biodiversity. All right. We have someone who is a former travel writer and now a climate writer. So this is right up your alley. She says, "I've struggled with climate writing being accurate." So for instance, fiction based on science rather than utopian or dystopian. it's difficult sometimes to reconcile the timing of climate change and the timing of humans, who are the usual characters in books. I'd love to hear Emily Raboteau's thoughts on this timing conundrum. So I think this is a question in some ways about how do you narrate something happening on such geological time spans and like such vast Earth system changes when we're thinking on the level of the human or the character.
Yeah, the question makes me think of two things. The first is this sign that appeared in a bookshop window in Great Britain a couple of years ago that said something along the lines of like the apocalyptic fiction is now placed in current events. Something like that. You remember that, Sarah?
It's amazing.
It's like a distressing joke. But I bring that up just to say, I think in a sense, climate fiction or people imagining apocalyptic situations is always, it's sometimes framed as a future eventuality, right? Whereas we are really, I think, in the midst of it. And as a student of mine described in my climate writing class last night, part of this feeling of being so unsettled has to do with existing in the middle of a story we don't know the outcome of. And I think that's an interesting space to write from, to say, like, the future is now. The disaster, I think we all know about the disaster narrative, and we're in the midst of disaster. So I think, writing that doesn't pretend something is going to come in the future, but actually contends with what we're in the middle of, interests me personally. Mm-hmm. And then the second thing, many of you are familiar probably with Richard Powers' Pulitzer Prize winning book, The Overstory, which is about trees, which doesn't center human timescale or humans as the protagonists, although there are humans in the book. We're really thinking on a different timescale and thinking about the lives of trees, which was a very, it felt, I think, was appropriately awarded and critically received as like a radical narrative, because it wasn't centering humans. Like how striking and strange and interesting was that? But there's like a link between that and Robin Wall Kimmerer I mentioned earlier, as an influence on me and many others in terms of getting us to think about or decenter ourselves as the protagonists of the story, and maybe to think about our kinship with the non-human world, and also the ways in which some of us are the villains of the story, right? Like, we talk about climate change, but we also need to talk about species extinction because of the behavior of humans. And so in answer to the question, I think it's interesting to stop framing disaster as a future story, to start framing disaster as a current event, and also to look to the people who are already decentering humans as the heroes of stories, because there are writers doing that.
Yes, I would add, I'm really interested in tracking the rise of collective narratives as well. It's one of the reasons I was so drawn to your work, Emily, with friendships, because I think so often stories will have one focal character, one hero, like it's a hero narrative. And I think with climate change, it's so difficult to tell stories about a solitary main character. It almost has to be a collective story in some ways, which is a real challenge, I think, narratively for us.
I think if you're going for a global scale, it is a challenge. And one other essay that I went about this, it was, a kind of experiment for me, but I think one that paid off in terms of like narrative risk, was a crowdsourced essay that I wrote originally on Twitter, and that was later published in New York Magazine, edited by David Wallace Wells, who I mentioned earlier as an influence for Uninhabitable Earth. And that was, I made a New Year's resolution, the year 2019, to just talk about climate change, after learning from the climate scientist Catherine Hayhoe that one of the best things we can do to act on this crisis is just to talk about it, because there's a real climate silence when you compare the amount of people who are concerned or afraid or even terrified about the crisis with the amount of us who actually talk about it at all. There's a huge discrepancy. So I just began asking my friend and family group, at the risk of spoiling dinner, how are you, as an individual, like, how are you, Sarah, feeling the effects of climate change in your local habitat and in your body? And then I just did that all the time, and I recorded what people were saying. And because I live in a global city and teach at a public university, I have a pretty international group circle. And so what I did for a year was just chronicle what people were saying. And it would be almost a fallacy to say I wrote that. I just collected what people were telling me and put it together in kind of this almost a poem, right? Almost like but what it began to help me see, and I hope for the reader to see, is like the rhyming that was happening between what a friend in Marin County on the West Coast was saying about her fear about forest fires, with what a friend in Sydney, Australia was saying about her fear about fires, with what a friend in the Black Forest in Germany was saying about fires, with what a friend in Lebanon was saying about fires, and using the same language.
Yeah. I think if I had to pick a favorite piece of yours, Emily, that would be it. So yes, we have even more questions, but because we are near the close of our time together, I'm wondering if you would be willing to share words from Barry Lopez.
Yeah, thank you for reminding me of that. That's a great way to close. I'm just looking at my phone to pull up his letter to me. I wrote to him in 2018 when I was working on my first climate essay, which was the one that I worked on after touring New York City with Mick to try to process what was happening to our city. And the reason I wrote to him was for just advice about how to tackle this subject. And he said, American denial about climate change reminds me of Borges's summary dismissal of some logical positivist's pronouncement, irrefutable but unconvincing. Perhaps one of the problems we're having as writers around this issue is that we don't know how to paint a dark enough picture and then follow this with an evocation of humanity's strengths that empowers or animates people sufficiently to keep them from caving in the face of the dark picture. I hope this non-answer at least stimulates thoughts of your own.
I love that. It's particularly evocative just as a passing of the torch. I hope this stimulates thoughts of your own. Emily, I just want to thank you so much for joining us tonight. This has been a conversation I've been looking forward to all semester, and I know I've heard from other people as they've reached out in anticipation of the event that they're just so grateful you have come and shared not only your words and ideas with us, but just your presence and insight. So thank you so much. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you, Sarah. I hope the conversation will continue.
Me too. And for everyone who is on our call tonight, I want to remind you of the Mahindra Center website, where you can find upcoming events to continue learning alongside us here. Thank you so much for spending the evening with us, Emily, and everyone on this call. Stay well and good night.